I'm Jane Haig, and this is the umpteenth video that we're doing for Bible Women. We're having a wonderful time with the Sunday morning forums, the Thursday morning Bible study. So join us if you can. If not, I'm glad you're tuning in to these videos. This morning, I want to introduce Pat Hall. And so, Pat, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came here and all that.
Came here in 1970. I am now a retired nurse, but at that time I came with my two young children who were raised at St. Margaret's, and now I have three granddaughters who are also being raised at St. Margaret's. And through the years, I've served in many capacities in the church. Most recent was I just retired from being the parish nurse.
Mm-hmm. And we miss you as parish nurse.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
What did you learn about Ruth and the women of Bethlehem? Last week we did Ruth and Naomi and Orpah. This week we're learning a lot more about Ruth.
Right. Ruth is, as might have been described last week, is a Moabite, which was part of a group of people that were on the outs with the Israelites. And during the famine, when Naomi and her husband and two sons moved to Moab, over time, then the two sons married Moabite women, one of which was Ruth. And when the sons and the father died, then Naomi decided to go back to Bethlehem, where she had some property and maybe some relatives. And after 10 years, things changed. She wasn't sure. And she gave the option to her daughter-in-laws to then return to their own family. Orpah remained in Moab, but Ruth made the 50-mile journey back uphill, I understand, all the way, back up to Bethlehem. We're not sure how they made the trip, but more likely they walked. Hopefully they were with other people because there were a lot of bandits along the way. So it was probably a very grueling walk for them. I'm not sure what they were using for money to buy food. So they might have arrived in Bethlehem rather disheveled and worked, hard times. So we got that far, and then they had to find some way to exist.
Yeah.
So Naomi told, and Ruth decided that Ruth would go out and glean at the end of the harvest of the barley and the wheat, which was a protocol that the women or people that were impoverished were allowed to follow behind the reapers and then glean what was left over. So Ruth went to a field and fell in behind some of the reapers, and the way the Bible describes it, it was probably a kind of a precarious thing to do. As we get into the story, and Boaz tells her to stay with his women and not to go to another field. So you get the idea that this was something that the women sort of put their safety in jeopardy being out in the fields like that. So the owner of the field, Boaz, a relative of Naomi's husband, asked about the young woman. We don't know whether she was beautiful and he noticed her that way, or because she was a Moabite and had features and maybe even clothing that was different. But she stood out enough that he asked about her, and his reaper said she came and had been working all day very hard. And so he approached her and told her to stay with his people and not to go to another field. At that point, knowing that she was the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and that he was a relative, that he probably felt some obligation to make sure that she stayed safe. So.
Yeah. We talked earlier at the Bible study at the study about the woman of Ruth, about what kind of person she must have been and her situation, whether I mean, she was a Moabite, but she clearly had a clear devotion toward her mother-in-law. Whether Naomi was just such a super woman that Ruth wanted to stick with her, or what Ruth's childhood growing up must have been. It was, but it's still that classic Ruth turning to Naomi and saying, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Because Ruth was born not worshiping one God, but many gods.
Right.
The Moabites did that. So,
and you would like to think that that story that Naomi may have told her daughter-in-laws or sons, and then to the daughter-in-laws, about what this one God was like, and that how appealing that might have been in the midst of maybe many gods who many times were angry, revengeful. Although at this point in history, the Israelite God was sort of that way too.
Right.
Right.
And that there was famine going on, either in Judah, and that's why they ended up in Moab, and then now that there's more famine seemingly in Moab than Judah, that's what took Naomi back home. But
Right.
And Naomi says, well, we're going back home because God has been pleased with the Judeans, and so therefore given them food. And you wonder whether that's part of why Ruth wanted to adopt the new Israel God, was that, hey, I'm going to go with a God that gives you food.
Right. Or that she couldn't bear the thought of her dear mother-in-law going off on her own by herself through the wild countryside, and loved her enough to give up everything else to go with her.
Very true.
Right. Anyway, when they get back to Bethlehem, then they run into the women in Bethlehem. And they're divided them up in three groups, and we don't know whether they were all the same people at three different times, or a mixture of people at each.
Sort of a crowd scene.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the first ones were kind of catty. Is this Naomi?
You look terrible.
Yeah, she, obviously probably left. They had property, so they, probably were in pretty good means when they left there. And here she comes back after making that trek, and looking pretty disheveled, and bringing this foreign woman with her. So you think, oh. And what do we do when new people come in our midst? Do we greet them with open arms, or do we then say, "Wow, who is that?" And they look different. They're and keep them at a distance. So it's a good lesson for us to think about, how do we greet new people?
Especially those that look different,
right?
Or even the implication that something was wrong with Naomi because she'd fallen on such hard times, and she looked so much older than when she had left.
Right, and she was out of favor with God because all the men had died, and so therefore she had no value.
Well, but Naomi responded by saying, "Don't call me Naomi anymore," which means, what was it? Happy and joyous, or something like that.
Right.
Call me Mara means bitter, because God has been angry and I am disfavored from God.
Right.
Which means I want to turn to Naomi and say, "Excuse me, you just had a spat of bad luck, girl." But
that was the times.
That was the times.
Right. Which again, did Ruth want to be a part of a religion where God treated women so badly if they didn't have a man or someone to provide for them? Don't know. At any rate, so the story goes on, and so then Naomi makes a little plot to get Ruth in a better situation, which would mean finding a husband. And so she has Ruth go at the end of the harvest to the threshing floor And when Boaz had finished celebrating the end of the harvest and had eaten and drunk all he wanted and sort of collapsed on the floor of the threshing room, that she was to go and remove his clothing from his feet and then lay down beside him. Well, the feet has another connotation in Hebrew. It could mean another part of the body. And so if she had exposed that and laid down beside him, it was sort of a thing saying, I'm available. Anyway, he wakes up at midnight and finds her lying there, and then says to her, okay, just stay right there, stay until, a little later, but get out of here before anybody knows that you're here, so keep your virtue intact, and we'll figure out what we're going to do from here. And so she goes back and tells Naomi that, and she said, he's going to be right on top of it by tomorrow morning. And he was, and he went out, and there was a closer relative than him, so, and he just happened to walk by right outside the gate.
The closer relative.
The closer relative, yes. And so Boaz tracks him down and says, okay, we've got this cousin or relative, Naomi, and she has this land, and you're the first guy in line for this. And he says, oh, okay. And he says, but you got to take Ruth along with it. And he says, maybe not.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that because it'll affect my inheritance. Because evidently the land that belonged to Naomi's husband, whose name is hard to say,
Elimelech.
Or
Elimelech. Yeah.
Anyway, so the land would stay in that Elimelech's family name, and any offspring of that would be in that family name, not the person that was the redeemer of Naomi and Ruth. At any rate, so he gave it up, and Boaz says, okay, I'll take them on, and to show that I give you my sandal, which was a sign that this is, the compact is complete, and we're ready to go. So
I didn't remember the part about the sandal.
Anyway, so then Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth gives birth to a son. And the women of Bethlehem show up again. Don't know where they've been all this time, but
it's kind of like the Valkyries. They kind of show up in the middle of the opera,
right?
But yeah.
And they were very excited for Naomi because now she has a line, and they say now, Naomi, you have a son, and meaning that she has been redeemed by God, and that now she has a protector that has come back into her life, and so. They make his name Obed, and means servant, and so that's sort of where we close the thing. So,
and as a teaser, that becomes one of the four fathers of David, and then forefathers of Jesus. So, and the fact that Boaz's mother was Rahab, who was a prostitute. So that maybe Boaz had a kindness in his heart for women who were not necessarily socially acceptable, but good people.
And there was some writing saying that this is possibly put in there to show that God was really looking at everyone and making use of everyone, and it wasn't a closed society that they were trying to make it, because God kept throwing in other characters from questionable to the Israelites, but still a part of our history.
Interesting. So do you want to be like Ruth?
Do I want to be like Ruth? I don't know that I could have followed my mother-in-law, depending on the relationship of that. Would I have given up everything, and even my gods, to be in another relationship, give up everything I know? I don't know, and I hope I don't get put in that position.
No, well, it must have been, you look at the great sacrifice or the strength and courage that Ruth had, but as somebody pointed out, well, maybe Naomi was just one of those really special people.
Yes.
And Ruth said, I'm going with you, and I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to do the best for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I get a little mixed up with my mother-in-law, so I'm thinking, but maybe Naomi was just the ultimate of women, in her strength and her courage.
But on the other hand, if my mother-in-law had lost her husband, all her sons, and needed to go back to where she could possibly have some other relatives around her, would I give up and go with her? If I didn't have any children, possibly.
Yeah.
So
Maybe going with Naomi was the best bet for
Mm-hmm.
Ruth. But boy, I tell you, that beautiful refrain, where you go, I will go. Amazing.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming and doing this. And it's been a delight, so thank you.
You're welcome.